The year is 1305, and through the fog-shrouded streets of medieval London, a broken man is being dragged naked behind a horse, his body scraping against the cobblestones as thousands of jeering spectators hurl filth and curses at the once mighty warrior who had dared to defy an empire. This is not how legends are supposed to end. This is not the glorious death in battle that William Wallace, Scotland's greatest hero, might have imagined for himself in the heat of combat at Stirling Bridge or during those desperate, defiant years when he embodied his nation's fierce determination to be free. No, this is something far more calculated, far more cruel, a spectacle of suffering orchestrated by a king who understood that some men are too dangerous to simply kill, that their very existence must be obliterated in such horrifying fashion that the memory itself becomes a warning to all who might dare follow in their footsteps. But to understand the full horror of what happened to William Wallace on that terrible August day in 1305, to truly grasp why his execution remains one of the most savage acts of medieval brutality ever recorded, we must journey back to the beginning, to a Scotland on the brink of annihilation, to the rise of a man who would become a symbol of resistance so powerful that even his enemies could never truly destroy him. Our story begins not with Wallace's death, but with the death of a kingdom, for in the late 13th century, Scotland found itself thrust into a crisis that would reshape its destiny forever. A crisis born from the simple tragedy of a king who fell from his horse on a dark and stormy night. King Alexander III had ruled Scotland with wisdom and strength, presiding over what many historians would later call a golden age, a time of relative peace and prosperity when Scottish culture flourished and the relationship with England, though never entirely comfortable, remained at least manageable. But on March 19, 1286, returning from a council meeting in Edinburgh to his young bride at Kinghorn, Alexander's horse lost its footing on the treacherous coastal path, and in that single moment of equine misstep, everything changed. The king's body was discovered the following morning, his neck broken, his reign ended, and Scotland suddenly found itself without a clear succession, for Alexander's children had all predeceased him, leaving only his infant granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as heir to the Scottish throne. The Scottish nobles, those proud and quarrelsome lords who had never quite mastered the art of unified action, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to establish a regency for a child they had never met, a child living across the North Sea in a foreign court, and worse still, they knew that their powerful neighbor to the south, King Edward I of England, would view this instability as an opportunity. Edward I, known to history as Longshanks for his imposing height and to his Welsh subjects as the Hammer of the Scots, was not a man to let opportunity pass unexploited. He was a warrior king of formidable intelligence and ruthless ambition, a man who had already conquered Wales with methodical brutality, building a ring of massive stone castles that still stand today as monuments to English dominance. When little Margaret died in 1290 during the voyage to Scotland, never having set foot in the kingdom she was meant to rule, Edward saw his chance, and the Scottish nobles, desperate to avoid civil war among the various claimants to the throne, made the fatal mistake of inviting him to arbitrate their succession crisis. It was like inviting a wolf to guard the sheep, and Edward played his role with Machiavellian brilliance, ultimately selecting John Balliol as king precisely because Balliol was weak, precisely because he could be controlled. For a time, the arrangement worked as Edward intended. Balliol proved himself to be exactly the puppet king that Edward had hoped for, until 1295 when the Scottish nobles, chafing under English dominance and watching as Edward demanded Scottish troops for his wars in France, convinced their timid king to do something remarkable. Balliol, finding some reserve of courage he hadn't known he possessed, signed the Auld Alliance with France, that ancient treaty that would bind Scotland and France together for centuries, and in that moment of defiance, he sealed Scotland's fate and his own. Edward's response was swift and merciless. In 1296, his army swept into Scotland like an avenging tide, beginning with the sack of Berwick-upon-Tweed, where English soldiers slaughtered thousands of men, women, and children in an orgy of violence intended to terrorize Scotland into submission. The Scottish army, badly led and poorly organized, was crushed at the Battle of Dunbar, and John Balliol, stripped of his royal insignia in a ceremony of deliberate humiliation that earned him the mocking title Tomb Tabard or Empty Coat, was dragged south to imprisonment in the Tower of London. Scotland, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist as an independent nation. Edward installed English administrators, seized Scottish lands, and even took the Stone of Destiny, upon which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries, carting it off to Westminster Abbey where it would remain for 700 years. It seemed as though Scotland's independence had been extinguished forever, that the proud kingdom would be absorbed into England's growing empire just as Wales had been, and perhaps it would have been if not for the emergence of a man whose origins remain shrouded in mystery and legend, a man whose name was William Wallace. We know frustratingly little about Wallace's early life with any certainty. Even basic facts like his exact birthplace remain subjects of historical debate, though tradition places his birth around 1270 in either Elderslie in Renfrewshire or Ellerslie in Ayrshire, both small communities in the Scottish lowlands. His father was likely a minor knight named either Malcolm or Alan Wallace. The records are contradictory on this point, and William himself was probably the younger son, which meant he would not inherit his father's lands and would have to make his own way in the world. The surname Wallace itself derives from the Old English Wylisk, meaning foreigner or Welshman, suggesting that his ancestors may have been Britons from the ancient kingdom of Strathclyde, though by William's time, his family had been established in Scotland for generations. Much of what we think we know about Wallace's early life comes from a 15th century epic poem written by a minstrel known as Blind Harry, a work composed nearly 200 years after Wallace's death and filled with dramatic embellishments, romantic inventions, and patriotic myth-making that make it more literature than history. According to Blind Harry, Wallace married a woman named Marion Braidfute and was driven to rebellion when English soldiers killed her in retaliation for his attacks on their troops. But there is no contemporary evidence to support this story, no documents or records from Wallace's own time that mention a wife at all. What we do know with certainty is that in May 1297, William Wallace burst onto the historical stage in spectacular fashion by killing William de Heselrigg, the English sheriff of Lanark, along with several of his men, an act of violence that could have been motivated by personal revenge, by patriotic fury, or by simple outlaw desperation. We will never know for certain. What followed transformed a local troublemaker into a national leader. Wallace's bold act attracted other disaffected Scots to his banner, men who had seen their lands confiscated, their families humiliated, their very identity as Scots ground beneath English boots. While nobles might hesitate, bound by oaths of fealty and concerns about their estates, common men and minor gentry flocked to Wallace, and in that fiery crucible of rebellion, a leader was forged. In the north, another resistance leader named Andrew de Moray was conducting his own campaign of raids and castle seizures, and when Wallace and Moray joined forces in the summer of 1297, they found themselves at the head of an army that, while lacking the heavy cavalry and professional training of English forces, burned with a determination that would prove more valuable than armor. The English, busy with their war in France and confident that Scottish resistance was a minor irritation, sent John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, to deal with the rebels, and Warenne, an aging nobleman who had seen better days, approached the task with the combination of arrogance and complacency that would prove disastrous. On September 11, 1297, at a narrow wooden bridge crossing the River Forth at Stirling, Wallace and Moray would fight a battle that would echo through Scottish history for centuries. A battle that proved conclusively that English military might could be defeated by Scottish courage and tactical brilliance. The situation at Stirling Bridge should have been a death trap for the Scots. They were outnumbered by a professional English army that included armored knights who had fought in France, experienced infantry, and Welsh archers whose longbows had already proven devastatingly effective. But Wallace and Moray had chosen their ground with the eye of born strategists. The bridge itself was so narrow that only 2 or 3 horses could cross abreast, turning the English advantage in cavalry into a liability, and on the northern side, the ground became marshy, further limiting the mobility of mounted knights weighed down by armor. The Scottish forces waited on the high ground overlooking the bridge. Their spearmen formed into tight defensive formations called schiltrons, circular or rectangular masses of men with their 12-foot spears bristling outward like a hedgehog's quills, a formation that could stop a cavalry charge if the men held their nerve. When English scouts advised Warenne that there was a ford upstream where the army could cross more safely, the Earl arrogantly dismissed the suggestion, apparently considering it beneath his dignity to take the longer route to deal with what he viewed as a rabble of Scottish peasants. Hugh Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland and a man so despised by the Scots for his corruption and cruelty that his death would be celebrated with grotesque enthusiasm, urged immediate attack, reportedly saying, "Why do we thus protract the war and waste the king's treasure? Let us fight. It is our bounden duty." And so, on that September morning, the English army began to file across the narrow bridge, their cavalry moving slowly in the cramped space, their infantry pressing behind them, and Wallace and Moray watched and waited with the patience of predators. The moment came when roughly half the English army had crossed to the north side of the river, trapped in the loop of the Forth with the marshy ground limiting their movement, and then Wallace gave the signal. The Scottish spearmen charged down from the high ground, their battle cries echoing across the water, and before the English knights could organize a proper cavalry charge, before their superior numbers could be brought to bear, the Scots had seized control of the northern end of the bridge, cutting off any possibility of English reinforcements crossing to help their trapped comrades. The battle became a massacre. English cavalry, magnificent in their armor and training, found themselves unable to maneuver in the confined space, their horses becoming targets for Scottish spears, their formations dissolving into chaos. Hugh Cressingham died early in the fighting, pulled from his horse and cut to pieces by Scottish soldiers who had suffered under his administration, and legend claims, with what truth we cannot know, that Wallace later had strips of Cressingham's skin made into a sword belt, a grotesque trophy that would have been entirely in keeping with the brutal customs of medieval warfare. Some English soldiers tried to retreat across the bridge, creating a stampede that caused the structure to collapse under the weight, plunging hundreds of men into the river where they drowned, dragged under by the weight of their armor. Others attempted to swim the Forth, but the river was deep and the banks steep, and many more perished in its waters. By the time the killing stopped, somewhere around 5,000 English soldiers lay dead, including many knights whose ransoms should have made them valuable prisoners, but who had instead been cut down in the fury of Scottish vengeance. Only one English knight, Marmaduke de Thwing, managed to fight his way back across the bridge with a small group of men before it collapsed, earning a place in history for his courage and skill. Warenne, who had remained south of the river and witnessed the destruction of half his army, ordered the remaining troops to burn the bridge and then fled south with such haste that he didn't stop until he reached Berwick, abandoning Scotland to the victorious rebels and cementing his reputation as one of England's most incompetent commanders. The victory at Stirling Bridge made Wallace a hero throughout Scotland. In the aftermath, he was knighted, presumably by one of the Scottish earls who supported the resistance, and appointed Guardian of Scotland, effectively making him the de facto ruler of the kingdom in the name of the imprisoned King John Balliol. Andrew de Moray, who had fought with equal valor and whose strategic genius may have been even greater than Wallace's, died of wounds received in the battle, robbing Scotland of a leader whose partnership with Wallace might have changed the course of the war. Wallace, now bearing the full weight of Scotland's hopes, immediately launched raids into northern England, a campaign of revenge and resource acquisition that saw his forces burning towns, seizing supplies, and demonstrating to Edward I that Scottish resistance was far from broken. Wallace also began the work of governance, issuing letters to foreign powers declaring Scotland's continued independence and seeking trade relationships, including a surviving letter to the merchants of Lubeck that bears both Wallace's seal and a mention of Andrew de Moray, suggesting that Wallace continued to honor his fallen comrade's contributions even after his death. But Wallace, for all his qualities as a guerrilla leader and inspirational figure, was not prepared for what was coming, for Edward I, enraged by the defeat at Stirling Bridge and determined to crush Scottish resistance personally, began assembling an army far larger than anything Wallace had faced before. In the spring of 1298, Edward returned from France and marched north with a force that included over 2,000 armored cavalry, veteran English infantry, and crucially, large numbers of Welsh longbowmen whose weapon had already proven its devastating effectiveness in Edward's conquest of Wales. Wallace, knowing he could not match Edward's forces in open battle, initially employed a strategy of evasion and scorched earth, withdrawing before the English advance while destroying or removing anything that could feed or supply their army. The strategy nearly worked. Edward's supply lines, stretched thin by the rapid march north and disrupted by contrary winds that prevented his supply ships from reaching the Scottish coast, began to fail, and his army, hungry and exhausted, teetered on the edge of mutiny. The Welsh infantry, particularly ill-treated and underfed, actually rioted against English troops, and Edward's cavalry had to be deployed to restore order within his own ranks. A humiliating incident that revealed how close the campaign came to collapse. Edward was on the verge of ordering a retreat to Edinburgh when fate, that capricious force that had given Wallace victory at Stirling Bridge, now turned against him. Two Scottish nobles, Patrick de Dunbar, Earl of March, and others resentful of Wallace's rise to power, a commoner who now commanded earls and gave orders to men who considered themselves his social superiors, betrayed the location of Wallace's army to Edward, revealing that the Scots were encamped just 7 miles away near the town of Falkirk. Edward, sensing the opportunity he had been seeking, mobilized his forces immediately, despite his recent injury from being thrown and trampled by his horse which had broken several of his ribs. And on the morning of July 22, 1298, the English army found Wallace's forces deployed in a defensive position near Falkirk. Wallace had arranged his army in 4 massive schiltrons, those hedgehog formations of spearmen that had proven effective against cavalry at Stirling Bridge. But this time there was no narrow bridge to constrain the English advance, no marshy ground to limit their movements, and Wallace's forces included far fewer archers and cavalry than he needed to protect his infantry's flanks. Between the schiltrons, Scottish archers under Sir John Stewart of Jedburgh took their positions, and a small force of cavalry under Sir John Comyn, called the Red Comyn for his family's distinctive coloring, waited in reserve. According to legend, Wallace addressed his men with the words, "I have brought you to the ring. Now dance if you can," a defiant challenge that would prove tragically prescient. When the battle began, the English cavalry, divided into 4 divisions, swept around the Scottish flanks, and the fundamental weakness of Wallace's position became immediately apparent. The Scottish cavalry, outnumbered and outmatched by English heavy horse, fled the field almost immediately, with some sources suggesting that Comyn's withdrawal was deliberate, an act of aristocratic spite against the common-born guardian who had presumed to command his betters. The Scottish archers, exposed and lacking support, were cut down by English knights, and now the schiltrons stood alone, massive circular formations of spearmen who held their ground with desperate courage as wave after wave of cavalry crashed against them. For a time, the schiltrons held. English knights and horses died on Scottish spears, and the formations remained unbroken, proof of the discipline and bravery of Wallace's men. But then Edward deployed his secret weapon, the massed ranks of Welsh longbowmen who had transformed English warfare in the campaigns against Wales. The longbow, in the hands of a skilled archer, could loose arrows with terrifying rapidity and penetrating power, and Edward had thousands of these archers. They advanced to effective range and began pouring arrows into the tightly packed schiltrons, a rain of death against which the Scottish spearmen had no defense. Men fell by the hundreds, gaps appeared in the formations, and when the schiltrons began to break apart, English cavalry poured through the openings, cutting down the fleeing Scots with systematic brutality. The battle became a slaughter. Perhaps 1/3 of Wallace's army died that day, including many of his closest supporters like Sir John de Graham, whose friendship with Wallace would later inspire poems and legends. Wallace himself, fighting in the front ranks with his great 2-handed sword, somehow survived the carnage and managed to escape, though accounts vary wildly about the details, with some claiming his horse carried him across the River Carron before collapsing from its wounds. The defeat at Falkirk destroyed Wallace's military reputation and his position as Guardian of Scotland. By December 1298, he had resigned his guardianship in favor of Robert the Bruce and John Comyn, noblemen whose aristocratic credentials made them more acceptable leaders to Scotland's feudal hierarchy. But while Wallace no longer held official power, he remained a symbol of resistance, a reminder that Scotland had once stood up to England and won, and more practically, he remained a skilled guerrilla fighter who continued to harass English forces and make Edward's occupation of Scotland costly and difficult. For the next 7 years, Wallace lived as a hunted man, possibly traveling to France to seek support from King Philip IV, possibly going to Rome to appeal to the Pope, though evidence for these diplomatic missions remains frustratingly unclear. What is certain is that Edward I, who might have been willing to pardon other Scottish leaders who submitted to his authority, would never forgive Wallace. To Edward, Wallace represented something intolerable, a commoner who had humiliated English armies, killed English soldiers, and inspired Scottish resistance, a man whose very existence challenged the natural order as Edward understood it. The English king pursued Wallace with relentless determination, offering rewards for his capture, pressuring Scottish nobles to hunt him down, and making clear that Wallace could never find peace while Edward lived. The betrayal, when it came, was accomplished by a Scottish knight named Sir John de Menteith, who was serving as keeper of Dumbarton Castle and had sworn loyalty to Edward in exchange for maintaining his position and lands. On August 3, 1305, at Robroyston near Glasgow, Menteith arranged to meet with Wallace, possibly on the pretext of discussing coordination with Robert the Bruce, who was at that time playing a complicated double game of nominal submission to Edward while positioning himself for a renewed bid for Scottish independence. What happened at Robroyston has been embellished by legend over the centuries, with Blind Harry's epic poem claiming that Wallace was betrayed by a servant who removed his weapons while he slept, allowing English soldiers to capture him without a fight. But whatever the exact circumstances, the result was that William Wallace, who had evaded capture for 7 years, suddenly found himself in English hands. Menteith delivered Wallace to English commanders, and the former Guardian of Scotland was bound in chains and transported south, a journey that would take over 2 weeks and carry him 400 miles from his homeland to London and the fate that Edward had been planning for years. Edward did not want Wallace executed quickly and quietly in Scotland where he might become a local martyr. He wanted Wallace's death to be a public spectacle in England's capital, a demonstration of English power and a warning so terrible that no Scot would dare follow Wallace's example. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was taken from his prison and brought to Westminster Hall, that magnificent chamber which had already witnessed centuries of English history and would continue to serve as the setting for great state occasions for centuries to come. The trial that followed was a farce, a predetermined conclusion dressed in the trappings of legal procedure. Wallace was not permitted to speak in his own defense, was not allowed to call witnesses, was not given any opportunity to contest the charges against him. He stood before a commission headed by Peter Mallor, Edward's chief justiciar, and listened as the charges were read, a litany that included treason against the English crown, murder of English soldiers and civilians, burning English towns, and various other acts of warfare that in any other context would have been considered the normal conduct of military operations. When the charge of treason was read, Wallace did manage to shout out his response, declaring that he could not be a traitor to a king to whom he had never sworn allegiance, a technically accurate point that highlighted the illegitimacy of the entire proceeding, for Wallace had always fought in the name of King John Balliol, Scotland's deposed monarch, and had never acknowledged Edward's claim to rule Scotland. But Edward's judges were not interested in legal niceties or questions of legitimacy. Wallace had been convicted before he ever entered Westminster Hall, and the sentence had already been prepared, the execution already arranged, the terrible machinery of his death already set in motion. The sentence was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a form of execution reserved for traitors and designed to inflict maximum suffering while allowing the condemned man's agony to serve as public entertainment and education. To understand the full horror of what was done to William Wallace, we must examine each phase of this brutal punishment. For the English had refined the art of judicial murder into a carefully orchestrated spectacle of suffering that would have impressed the Romans in their cruelest days. The first phase began immediately after sentencing when Wallace was stripped naked, an act of deliberate humiliation intended to rob him of any dignity, and tied to a wooden hurdle, a kind of wooden frame or sledge. He was then dragged behind horses from Westminster through the streets of London to Smithfield, a distance of over 4 miles across rough cobblestones and rutted roads. This was not a quick journey. The procession moved slowly to allow the maximum number of Londoners to witness Wallace's humiliation, to jeer and throw refuse at the man who had killed English soldiers, and to begin softening his body for the tortures to come. The dragging would have scraped the skin from his back, legs, and buttocks, leaving a trail of blood through London's streets, and the rough treatment would have battered his internal organs against the hard wood of the hurdle, causing immense pain and internal injuries. By the time Wallace reached Smithfield, which was then on the outskirts of London near the Priory of St. Bartholomew the Great and served as the city's main meat market, his body would already have been a mass of lacerations and bruises, but his ordeal had barely begun. At Smithfield, a crowd of spectators had gathered, their mood festive despite the grim purpose of their assembly, for public executions were considered entertainment in medieval England, a chance to see justice done and to witness the suffering of those who had defied the established order. Gallows had been erected, and Wallace was hauled up onto a platform where he could be clearly seen by the entire crowd, and here the next phase of his torture began. He was hanged by the neck, but critically not to death. The executioner's art required that Wallace be strangled just to the point of unconsciousness, carefully keeping him alive for the horrors that would follow. Hanging in this manner would have caused agonizing pressure on his windpipe, crushing pain in his neck and shoulders, and the terrifying sensation of suffocation as his body was denied oxygen, all while he remained conscious enough to understand what was happening. When the executioner judged that Wallace had reached the appropriate level of semi-consciousness, he was cut down from the gallows and laid out on a table or platform where the crowd could clearly see what happened next, and here the torture took on its most grotesque dimension. While Wallace was still alive, still capable of feeling pain and understanding what was being done to him, the executioner performed the drawing part of the sentence, which meant disembowelment. With a sharp knife, the executioner made an incision in Wallace's abdomen and reached inside to pull out his intestines and other internal organs, displaying them to the crowd while Wallace, despite his weakened state, would still have been conscious enough to see his own entrails being removed from his body, a level of horror that is almost impossible for the modern mind to fully comprehend. The intestines and other organs were then thrown into a fire that had been prepared nearby and burned while Wallace watched, the medieval theory being that a traitor's internal corruption should be purged by flames. During this process, Wallace was also emasculated. His genitals were cut off, another act of deliberate humiliation and an assault on his very manhood, a final degradation of a man who had dared to challenge English authority. Only after this prolonged torture, only after Wallace had endured more suffering than most human beings could possibly survive, was the executioner permitted to end his life. Wallace's heart was cut out, the medieval symbol of a man's courage and will, and then finally, mercifully, his head was cut off. But even in death, Wallace's body was not allowed to rest, for the final component of the sentence was quartering, the division of his corpse into 4 parts which would be sent to different locations throughout Scotland as a warning. Wallace's body was cut into 4 quarters, massive portions of human remains that were dispatched to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, for Scottish cities that would have been important enough to attract crowds who could view the rotting remains of the man who had once inspired Scottish resistance. His head, meanwhile, received special treatment. It was dipped in tar to preserve it and then placed on a spike atop London Bridge, where it would remain on display for years, a constant reminder to anyone crossing the Thames of what happened to those who defied the English crown. The location and timing of Wallace's execution carried additional symbolic weight that Edward had carefully orchestrated. Smithfield, besides being London's meat market where animals were slaughtered daily, was also the site of the Great Bartholomew Fair, which began on the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day, August 23rd, the very day of Wallace's execution. St. Bartholomew, one of Christ's apostles, was the patron saint of butchers and, according to tradition, had himself been martyred by being flayed alive, skinned in an act of brutal execution that made him an appropriate saint for the location where Wallace would be cut apart like a piece of meat. The crowds at the Bartholomew Fair, which typically lasted 3 days and attracted visitors from across England, would have witnessed Wallace's execution as the opening entertainment of their festival, ensuring maximum publicity for Edward's gruesome message. Moreover, historians have noted that the entire spectacle was designed to demonstrate Edward's dominance not just over Wallace personally, but over Scotland itself. The execution was timed and staged as a culminating event before Edward's plans to settle Scotland's governance, with many Scottish nobles summoned to London to witness what happened to those who resisted English rule. The message could not have been clearer: submit or suffer the same fate as Wallace. Yet, in inflicting this terrible death, Edward made a critical miscalculation, for martyrdom has a power that even the cruelest tyrant cannot control. Wallace's execution, rather than terrifying Scots into submission, instead transformed him from a controversial military leader into a timeless symbol of Scottish resistance. A man who had suffered the worst that England could inflict and had never begged for mercy, never renounced his cause, never betrayed his country. There is no reliable historical evidence that Wallace shouted "freedom" during his execution as depicted in the movie Braveheart, and indeed, given that he would have been semi-conscious during much of his torture and his mouth likely damaged during the hanging, such a cry would have been physically impossible. But the power of Wallace's example did not require such theatrical gestures. His willingness to endure unimaginable suffering rather than submit to English authority spoke more eloquently than any words could have. In the immediate aftermath of Wallace's death, it might have seemed that Edward had achieved his goal. Scotland remained under English occupation, its nobles largely submitted to English authority, and the resistance that Wallace had led appeared crushed. But within a year, Robert the Bruce, who had been playing a careful game of nominal loyalty to Edward while positioning himself for independence, made his move. In February 1306, Bruce murdered his rival John Comyn in a church at Dumfries, an act of sacrilege and political violence that forced him to commit fully to rebellion since there could be no forgiveness for such a crime, and by March, he had himself crowned King of Scotland at Scone. Bruce's early years as king were disastrous. He was defeated repeatedly by English forces, forced to flee to the Western Isles, reduced at one point to hiding in caves while English troops hunted him like a criminal. But Bruce learned from these defeats, adopted many of Wallace's guerrilla tactics, and gradually built a resistance movement that would prove more successful than anything Wallace had achieved. In 1314, 9 years after Wallace's execution and 2 years after Edward I's death, Bruce won the decisive Battle of Bannockburn, a stunning victory that destroyed English power in Scotland and established Scottish independence on a foundation that would last for centuries. When Bruce finally secured Scotland's independence through the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, he ensured that Wallace was remembered and honored, understanding that his own success had been built on the foundation that Wallace had laid, that the spirit of resistance Wallace had embodied had never truly died despite all of Edward's brutality. The execution that was meant to destroy Wallace's legacy had instead ensured that he would be remembered forever, not as a defeated rebel but as a martyr whose sacrifice had meaning, whose suffering had purpose, whose death had helped give birth to a free Scotland. Over the following centuries, Wallace's story would be retold, reimagined, and mythologized by each generation of Scots, seeking to understand their own identity and relationship with their southern neighbor. Blind Harry's epic poem, composed around 1470, transformed Wallace into a nearly superhuman hero, embellishing his deeds with fantastic adventures and romantic subplots that had little basis in historical fact, but captured the essence of what Wallace represented to the Scottish imagination. The poem claimed that Wallace was over 6 feet tall in an era when most men stood closer to 5'6", that he could bend iron bars with his bare hands, that he single-handedly killed hundreds of Englishmen in various encounters, and while these claims are obvious exaggerations, they reflect the genuine reverence in which Wallace was held. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Scottish Romanticism flourished and poets like Robert Burns wrote stirring odes to Wallace's memory, the executed rebel became an icon of Romantic nationalism, a figure whose story could inspire not just Scots but oppressed peoples everywhere. The Wallace Monument, a massive Victorian Gothic tower built in the 1860s near the site of his victory at Stirling Bridge, stands 220 feet tall and dominates the landscape for miles, a physical testament to Wallace's enduring place in Scottish consciousness. In the 20th century, the movie Braveheart, despite its numerous historical inaccuracies, introduced Wallace's story to a global audience and helped inspire a resurgence of Scottish nationalism that would eventually lead to the re-establishment of a Scottish Parliament after nearly 300 years of full union with England. The film's depiction of Wallace's execution, while horrifying, was actually somewhat sanitized compared to the historical reality. The movie showed him being tortured on a public scaffold and then beheaded, but it omitted or downplayed the full extent of the disembowelment, emasculation, and quartering, perhaps because even Hollywood recognized that the complete truth would be too disturbing for contemporary audiences. Yet for all the mythologizing and romanticizing, for all the poems and monuments and movies, the basic historical facts about William Wallace remain both inspiring and tragic. The story of a man who rose from relatively humble origins to lead his country's resistance against overwhelming odds, who won spectacular victories and suffered devastating defeats, who lived as a hunted fugitive for years rather than surrender his principles, and who finally died with a courage that transformed his execution from a triumph for his enemies into a moral victory that would echo through the centuries. Wallace's death was indeed more terrifying than most people imagine, a carefully orchestrated symphony of suffering that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and medieval brutality, but it was also, in a strange and terrible way, a triumph of the human spirit's capacity to endure suffering in the service of something larger than itself. When we examine the specific details of Wallace's execution, when we force ourselves to confront the reality of what was done to him on that August day in 1305, we are confronting not just medieval savagery but a fundamental question about the nature of justice, authority, and resistance. Edward I believed that by inflicting maximum suffering on Wallace, by making his death so horrific that it would haunt the nightmares of anyone who witnessed it or heard about it, he could terrorize Scotland into permanent submission, could demonstrate that the cost of resistance was simply too high to bear. But Edward fundamentally misunderstood the dynamics of martyrdom and the power of symbolic sacrifice. By making Wallace's death so horrific, he ensured that it would be remembered, that it would be talked about, that it would become a story passed down through generations, and in that remembering, the suffering itself became transformed into meaning, the cruelty of the punishment becoming evidence not of English justice but of English tyranny, not of Wallace's criminality but of his heroism. The fact that Wallace refused to beg for mercy, even as he was being disemboweled, even as his own intestines were being burned before his eyes, even as he endured tortures that would break most human beings, became proof of the righteousness of his cause and the strength of Scottish character. Moreover, the specific manner of Wallace's death, the public spectacle of it, the deliberate humiliation and degradation, revealed something important about the nature of Edward's rule and the English occupation of Scotland. Edward did not simply execute Wallace. He tried to obliterate him, to reduce him to a collection of body parts displayed in different cities, to destroy not just the man but the very idea he represented. This level of vindictiveness, this obsessive need to utterly destroy Wallace, betrayed Edward's own fear, his recognition that Wallace represented something more dangerous than military skill or tactical brilliance, that he embodied a spirit of resistance that could not be killed simply by winning battles or occupying territory. And Edward was right to fear that spirit, for it did indeed survive Wallace's death, did indeed inspire the next generation of Scottish resistance under Robert the Bruce, did indeed ultimately lead to Scottish independence despite all of England's military advantages. The physical details of Wallace's execution, as horrifying as they are, also tell us something about medieval concepts of justice and the body, for the medieval worldview held that different types of crimes required different types of punishment, that the body itself could be read as a text upon which the state could write its messages. Hanging was the punishment for common criminals, a relatively quick death by medieval standards. Beheading was reserved for nobles, a recognition of their higher status that afforded them a more dignified end. But hanging, drawing, and quartering was something else entirely, a punishment so extreme that it was used only for high treason, for those who had violated the most sacred bonds of loyalty and allegiance. The symbolism of each component of Wallace's execution was carefully considered. The dragging behind horses reduced him to the status of an animal, something less than human. The hanging attempted to strangle the life from him while leaving him conscious enough to witness his own degradation. The emasculation attacked his manhood and his ability to father children who might continue his legacy. The disembowelment exposed his internal corruption and burned it away. The beheading finally granted. Death, after all other torments, had been exhausted, and the quartering distributed his remains across Scotland as a warning, attempting to make his very body a message of English dominance. Yet the effect was precisely the opposite of what Edward intended, for Wallace's willingness to endure this suffering rather than submit transformed him from a rebel into a Christ-like figure of sacrifice, a man who died for his country's freedom, whose broken body became a testament not to English power but to Scottish resistance. In the broader context of European history, Wallace's execution was not unique. Medieval and early modern Europe saw countless executions of similar brutality, and the punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering would remain on English law books for centuries, continuing to be used against traitors and rebels well into the 18th century. Guy Fawkes, the Catholic conspirator who attempted to blow up Parliament in 1605, was sentenced to the same fate, though he cheated the executioner by jumping from the gallows and breaking his neck before the full torture could be inflicted. The Jesuit priests Edmund Campion and Robert Southwell were hanged, drawn, and quartered in the 1580s and 1590s for the crime of being Catholic missionaries in Protestant England. Even as late as 1820, the Cato Street conspirators who plotted to assassinate British government ministers were sentenced to hanging and beheading, though by that time, the full horror of drawing and quartering had been quietly dropped from the punishment, a recognition that such medieval barbarity had no place in the supposedly enlightened 19th century. But Wallace's execution remains particularly memorable, particularly significant, because of its political context and its ultimate failure to achieve its intended purpose. For Edward's spectacular cruelty helped create the very thing he sought to destroy, a symbol of resistance that would outlive both men and shape Scottish identity for centuries. The psychological impact of such an execution on both the victim and the witnesses cannot be overstated. Modern research into extreme pain and trauma suggests that the human mind has certain protective mechanisms, including the release of endorphins and the onset of shock, that can partially mitigate suffering even in the most extreme circumstances. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that Wallace experienced some degree of dissociation during his torture, a mental detachment from the physical agony being inflicted on his body, though whether this provided any real relief or simply added a surreal quality to his nightmare is impossible to know. For the witnesses, watching a man being slowly tortured to death would have been a profoundly disturbing experience, even in an age far more accustomed to violence and suffering than our own. And we know from various historical accounts that public executions could have unpredictable effects on crowds, sometimes producing the desired intimidation but often generating sympathy for the victim and resentment toward the authorities inflicting the punishment. In Wallace's case, the crowd at Smithfield included many Londoners who had been encouraged to hate the Scottish rebel, who had been told stories of his atrocities against English civilians, who had been prepared to view his execution as righteous justice. Yet even among this hostile audience, there must have been some who watched his suffering and questioned whether any crime could justify such cruelty, whether any government that inflicted such torture could truly claim moral authority. The immediate political aftermath of Wallace's execution demonstrated the complex and often counterproductive nature of such spectacular violence. While many Scottish nobles did indeed submit to Edward's authority in the months following the execution, accepting his peace terms and agreeing to govern Scotland as English vassals, the very brutality of Wallace's death helped create a psychological space for future rebellion. Robert the Bruce, who witnessed or heard about Wallace's fate and understood what awaited him if his own plans for independence failed, nevertheless chose to move forward with rebellion less than a year later, suggesting that Wallace's example of resistance, even unto death, was more powerful than the fear Edward's brutality was meant to instill. Moreover, Wallace's execution helped crystallize Scottish identity in opposition to England in a way that would have profound long-term consequences. Before Wallace, Scottish national consciousness was relatively weak, with many Scots identifying more strongly with their local regions or clan affiliations than with Scotland as a unified nation. But the wars of Scottish independence and Wallace's role as a symbol of that struggle helped forge a sense of Scottish nationhood that would survive even the eventual union of the Scottish and English crowns in 1603 and the political union of the two kingdoms in 1707. The question of whether Wallace's death was worth the cause he died for, whether his suffering achieved anything meaningful, is one that historians and Scots have debated for centuries, and the answer depends partly on one's view of national independence and the value of self-determination. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, one could argue that Wallace's resistance and his death accomplished relatively little in the short term. Scotland remained under English occupation, his military victories were ultimately reversed, and the immediate cost in Scottish lives and suffering was immense. Yet, from a longer perspective, Wallace's example helped make Scottish independence possible by demonstrating that resistance was possible, that English armies could be defeated, that the cost of occupying Scotland would always be higher than the value of dominating it. Bruce's ultimate victory at Bannockburn, and the Scottish independence that followed, might never have happened without the groundwork Wallace had laid, without the inspiration his sacrifice provided, without the proof he had given that some things, including national freedom, were worth dying for in the most horrible ways imaginable. The legacy of Wallace's execution also extends beyond Scotland to influence broader discussions about resistance, martyrdom, and the limits of state power. Revolutionaries and independence movements throughout history have drawn inspiration from Wallace's example, seeing in his story a validation of their own struggles against oppressive authority. In Ireland, where centuries of English and later British rule created conditions not unlike those in medieval Scotland, Wallace was venerated as a kindred spirit, a Celtic hero who had stood against English domination. In colonial America, Patrick Henry's famous speech demanding liberty or death, while not explicitly referencing Wallace, echoed the same willingness to accept the worst that tyranny could inflict rather than submit to illegitimate authority. In the 20th century, anti-colonial movements in India, Africa, and elsewhere found inspiration in stories of indigenous resistance to imperial power, and Wallace's story, particularly as popularized by the film Braveheart, became part of a global narrative about the struggle for self-determination and the courage required to challenge seemingly invincible empires. Even today, in an age when most Western nations have abolished capital punishment and condemned torture as a violation of human rights, the story of Wallace's execution retains its power to shock and disturb us, to force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the relationship between the individual and the state. When we read the historical accounts of what was done to Wallace at Smithfield, when we try to imagine the reality of his suffering, we are reminded that the worst atrocities are often committed not by sadistic individuals acting on personal impulse but by organized states following legal procedures, by governments that believe they are defending the social order and punishing crime. Edward I was not a random psychopath. He was one of medieval England's most accomplished kings, a skilled administrator, a patron of law and architecture, a crusader who had fought for Christendom in the Holy Land. Yet this same man, acting through legal channels and with the full support of his government, orchestrated an execution of such cruelty that it continues to appall us 700 years later, demonstrating that evil can wear the face of order and civilization, that the worst suffering can be inflicted by those who believe themselves to be righteous. The contrast between the barbarism of Wallace's execution and the nobility of the cause he died for, between the cruelty of his killers and the courage he displayed in facing that cruelty, has made his story a perennial subject of artistic representation across multiple media and time periods. Poets, playwrights, novelists, and filmmakers have all been drawn to Wallace's story, recognizing in it elements of classical tragedy, heroic sacrifice, and timeless human drama. Each generation has reimagined Wallace in terms relevant to their own concerns. Medieval Scots saw him as a warrior saint. Enlightenment Scots viewed him as an early champion of liberty. Romantic-era writers portrayed him as a noble savage uncorrupted by civilization. And modern audiences have interpreted him as an everyman hero fighting against systemic oppression. This malleability of Wallace's image, this capacity for his story to be continually reinterpreted and reimagined, is itself a testament to the power of his sacrifice and the meaning that his death continues to hold across centuries and cultures. Yet amid all the mythologizing and reimagining, amid all the artistic representations and political appropriations of Wallace's memory, it is important to remember the basic human reality at the center of the story, that William Wallace was a real person who experienced real suffering, who felt real pain as his body was torn apart at Smithfield, who faced real death with whatever mixture of courage, terror, faith, and despair that any human being might feel in such circumstances. The theatrical elements of his execution, the public spectacle and symbolic violence, can sometimes obscure the simple fact that a man died horribly, that whatever abstract political or historical significance we might attach to that death, the suffering itself was immediate, physical, and personal. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Wallace's execution, not the political implications or historical consequences, but simply the reality of what was done to a human being, the fact that other human beings could inflict such suffering, that crowds could gather to watch it as entertainment, that a legal system could sanction it as justice, that a civilization could practice it as statecraft. In contemplating Wallace's death, we are forced to confront the darkest capacities of human nature, the ways in which ordinary people can participate in extraordinary cruelty when it is sanctioned by authority and dressed in the language of law and justice. The fact that similar brutalities continue to occur in various forms in the modern world, that torture remains a reality in many countries, that extrajudicial killings and political violence continue to claim lives in the name of state security or revolutionary justice, suggests that the lessons of Wallace's execution have not been fully learned, that the capacity for organized cruelty remains an aspect of human civilization that we have not yet overcome. And yet, paradoxically, the fact that Wallace's story continues to inspire us, that his willingness to endure suffering for a principle still moves us centuries after his death, also speaks to more hopeful aspects of human nature, to our capacity for courage and self-sacrifice, to our ability to find meaning in suffering, to our stubborn insistence that some things, including freedom and dignity, are worth dying for even in the worst possible ways. Wallace's execution was designed to be a demonstration of power, but it became instead a demonstration of the limits of power, proof that even the most brutal state violence cannot destroy ideas, cannot kill principles, cannot prevent martyrs from becoming symbols that outlive their executioners. Edward I, who ordered Wallace's execution, died in 1307, just 2 years after Wallace, while leading yet another campaign to conquer Scotland. His body was buried in Westminster Abbey, where his tomb can still be visited today, marked with the Latin inscription Scotorum Malleus, the Hammer of the Scots, a title that Edward would have considered his proudest achievement. Yet for all his power, for all his victories, for all his ruthless efficiency in crushing resistance, Edward's ultimate goal of permanently subjugating Scotland eluded him. Within a year of his death, Bruce had reversed most of English gains in Scotland, and within 7 years, Scottish independence had been decisively re-established at Bannockburn. The head that Edward had placed on London Bridge, the quarters he had sent to Scottish cities, the elaborate brutality he had orchestrated to destroy Wallace's memory. All of these efforts failed to achieve their intended purpose, and instead ensured that Wallace would be remembered as a hero while Edward, despite his many genuine accomplishments, would be remembered in Scotland primarily as a tyrant and an enemy. This reversal of fortune, this transformation of intended humiliation into eternal glory, is perhaps the final irony of Wallace's execution, the last and most complete failure of Edward's brutal plan. Today, more than 7 centuries after that terrible day at Smithfield, William Wallace remains Scotland's preeminent national hero, his memory honored in monuments, poems, songs, films, and the living consciousness of the Scottish people. While the specific details of his life remain frustratingly obscure, while historians continue to debate the accuracy of various legends and traditions, the essential truth of his story remains clear: that he was a man who chose resistance over submission, who fought for his country's independence when submission would have been easier and safer, and who ultimately paid the highest price for that choice. His death was indeed more terrifying than most people imagine, a carefully orchestrated atrocity that pushed the boundaries of human suffering and medieval cruelty. But it was also, in the end, a triumph of the human spirit over the forces that sought to break it, a demonstration that even the most horrific physical torture cannot destroy the power of an idea whose time has come, and a reminder that the struggle for freedom and dignity, however costly, however painful, is a struggle that some souls will pursue unto death and beyond. In contemplating Wallace's fate, we are reminded of the terrible costs that freedom sometimes demands, the sacrifices that are required when ordinary people stand against powerful empires, and the strange alchemy by which suffering and death can be transformed into inspiration and hope for future generations who continue the struggle that martyrs begin. William Wallace died in agony at Smithfield on August 23, 1305, but his legacy lived on in the free Scotland that eventually emerged from the wars of independence, in the countless individuals throughout history who have drawn courage from his example, and in the enduring human conviction that there are indeed principles worth dying for, truths worth defending, and freedoms worth any price that tyranny might exact. His execution was meant to be the end of Scottish resistance. Instead, it marked the beginning of a legend that would outlive empires, a story of courage that would echo through the centuries, and a testament to the indomitable human spirit that even the worst tortures cannot break when it is in service of a cause greater than itself.